On a frozen river in Poland, a general counted the survivors of an army that had entered Russia 685,000 strong and returned as a haunted handful. The silence was louder than drums. Boots scraped ice. Breath rasped. Eyes stared through the world as if the world had ended somewhere in the white distance. Some men still held standards, cloth stiff with frost and torn by months that felt like years. Others clutched trinkets taken from a city that no longer existed in any way that mattered. Medals that meant little to fingers already missing 2 or 3 joints. If you watched from the bank, you might have seen the way shoulders drooped in unison, as if one long invisible rope had finally been cut and everything that was held up slid down into the earth. This matters because what vanished here was not just a great army, but an emperor's certainty, the scaffolding of an empire, and the story people thought they knew about winter and defeat. Before the snow, there was heat. Before the frost, there was pride. At the height of his power, Napoleon bent a continent to his will. Cities fell like dominoes. Empires knelt or were replaced. His map ran from the Atlantic surf to the Russian forests. He had broken Austria. He had humbled Prussia. He had met Russia on a raft in the middle of a river and drawn lines on water that looked like peace. Imagine the scene on that raft. 2 emperors, 2 entourages, uniforms shining, words that sounded like reconciliation floating above currents that never stopped moving. You can picture thin smiles, measured nods, promises penned on vellum that could be folded into pockets and carried home. Treaties make paper heavy with hope. Reality is heavier. Between land and sea stood Britain, beyond reach and beyond patience. So a blockade became policy, and policy became pressure, and pressure bent Russia until it snapped. In palaces and councils, insults accumulated, markets shrank, and stubbornness hardened into steel. Merchants watched, warehouses fill with unsold goods, and then watched them empty when smugglers cut their own paths through the Baltic. Noble families argued about honor and survival around tables where candles burned low and tempers burned high. A decision formed. Compliance would be enforced by a march, not a treaty. It would be fast. It would be limited. It would be decisive. That was the promise. The mobilization was astonishing. France could not send this alone. Italy, German states, Poles with old dreams of a nation, even reluctant allies stitched together by marriage and defeat. Picture the patchwork of languages in campfires at dusk. A man from Tuscany sharing bread with a Saxon. A Polish lancer telling a young French conscript about a homeland that had been sliced and served to others. Pride and grievance sat side by side and warmed their hands over the same flames. Warehouses swelled. Ovens were built to move with men. Bridges would be carried to rivers instead of waiting for rivers to accept. Crossings. Engineers rehearsed the choreography of mass. The army became a moving city with bakers and blacksmiths, with tailors and surgeons, with quartermasters who drew lines in notebooks and believed that neat columns of figures would hold back chaos. In June, the Niemen opened and the columns began. The ground trembled. Dust rose. Flags glowed against a wide sky. Across they went, expecting an opponent to offer battle on the frontier and honor the script. The script did not arrive. Roads dissolved into mud. Wagons sank. Cavalry mounts ate bark and leather, and then nothing. Supplies planned in neat lines stayed behind as reality twisted the plan. Foraging found thin villages, not fat barns. Rations shrank. Horses collapsed by thousands and did not rise. Then disease slipped through ranks like smoke. Typhus in uniforms, dysentery in streams, field hospitals overwhelmed. The army began to shed men without a single major clash to justify a grave. And still it pressed forward, chasing an enemy that refused to be caught. There are nights that repeat themselves in memory because hunger repeats itself. A drummer boy, 14, sits with his units and chews a strip of old saddle, eyes on the fire that eats wood faster than humans eat hope. A veteran tells him not to swallow too much at once, to let the leather soften, to pretend it is meat. Pretend is a fragile word. The Russian retreat looked like panic from a distance. Up close, it was a narrowing corridor. Grain was torched, livestock driven east, wells poisoned, bridges burned, villages turned to ash. Space was being traded for time, and time was eating the Grand Army faster than any musket. A city appeared as a promise. Smolensk fought and burned, then emptied. The walls took shot and held for a while. Then the streets became channels for fire and shouting. The inner life of a city poured out into fields and forests, the old and the very young crying in voices that carry farther than any drum. Moscow hovered beyond, a weight of history and the assumption that capitals compel surrender. The battlefield arrived first. Near a village west of Moscow, earthworks rose on ridges. Guns massed. Soldiers dug their own geometry into the land and waited. Borodino turned morning into a furnace. Artillery screamed. Men advanced into walls of shot and came apart, then kept moving. Forts changed hands, not once, but again and again. Bodies stacking in angular ditches until stepping meant stepping on the dead to reach the living. The Great Redoubt fell only after hours of cavalry and infantry tearing at each other within smoke so thick sight became touch. A flag planted on a mound meant little when the ground around the flag pulsed like a wounded thing. Victory was claimed because the ground was held, but the army opposite was not broken. It withdrew, alive enough to bleed later. The price was ruinous. Ask a survivor who stood in the Bagration fleshes, those arrow-shaped earthworks, whether the word victory felt like a blanket or a knife. He might show you scars and say that words are light and costs are heavy. The next promise was Moscow itself. The gates stood open. The Kremlin did not resist. The city waited not with a delegation, but with dry timbers and fire. In the night, flames woke in different quarters and raced each other. Fire pumps were gone because someone made sure they would be. Over days, wind fed a monster that ate streets, churches, warehouses, and hope. When the smoke thinned, 3/4 of Moscow was ash. The arsenals were empty. The granaries were mostly bare. No negotiations came. Letters rode north and returned as silence. The emperor walked through rooms occupied by ghosts of power and listened for footsteps that never arrived. He wrote messages that sounded like command and received nothing that sounded like compliance. Weeks slipped away and the calendar turned against men who were already thin shadows. Leaving became necessary. Leaving became late. The retreat first bent south, then turned back to the road they had stripped bare on the way in. Snow arrived like a whisper, and then spoke loudly. Packs had been thrown away to carry trophies. Coats were missing, boots were gone. Frost took fingers, noses, and ears. Men sat by fires and did not wake. Others fell where they stood, the cold finishing what hunger and sickness had begun. Horses died, and with them, the army's strength. Cannon were abandoned. Wagons stopped. Behind and beside, riders appeared like teeth in a storm. Cossacks did not fight the columns. They took the men who stepped out of them or fell behind. Partisans haunted the woods with grief sharpened into revenge. You can picture a small farmhouse with a family looking out through cracks in shutters, counting the figures that pass, then counting the ones who do not pass. A father lifts a musket that belonged to his own father and sets it down again. The land has memorized old invasions and knows how to whisper instructions to those who listen. The retreat ceased to be an army and became a moving graveyard. Smolensk gave almost nothing back. Krasnoy tried to cut the artery and nearly did. A rear guard stood and bled so others could keep moving until standing and bleeding became crossing a river in the dark under fire. Ice, taking men as bullets, took others. Before that river, there was another gamble. Maloyaroslavets, a town south of Moscow, burning as both sides fought through streets where houses became barricades and floors became graves. The idea was to turn south toward better lands and supplies. Then the smoking rubble and stubborn resistance drew a circle around that hope and squeezed. Back to the road of bones. Back to footprints that had already been filled with snow. When the last miracle was needed, engineers waded into freezing water to build bridges with torn houses and bare hands. The name of Eble, the commander of the Pontonniers, mattered less to the men he saved than the heat of the plank underfoot and the scream of the current at their calves. A river that should have been solid became a test instead. The crossing lasted days. Panic became a weapon, as much as cannon, and flames finally ended the bridge and left thousands on banks that would not be saved. There are accounts of men who walked out onto thin ice because stepping forward felt more possible than stopping, and who vanished without a sound that could be heard above the roar of chaos. The road west continued. Then the sleigh departed. Command changed hands. Some say the emperor left because the empire required him elsewhere, because his presence in Paris was needed to pull levers and lift spirits. Others say departure sounded like abandonment, that leaders must stand where the worst wind blows if they expect loyalty to remain warm. The count on the ice on that first day became a ledger of what ambition could not pay. From the army that entered, only a fraction walked back as soldiers. Many more crawled back as ghosts. The common story points at winter and stops there. Cold makes a clean villain. It absolves decisions. It turns defeat into weather. But the collapse began in summer. The scale could not be fed. Roads could not carry what was needed. Disease took more than battles by orders of magnitude. The start was late. The stay in an empty city was longer than sense would allow. The opponent used fire and emptiness as weapons and refused the treaty that tradition said must come. The winter itself was not a freak. It was Russian winter, terrible and predictable. Men from milder climates met it unprepared, and unprepared became unforgiving. If you wonder what unprepared looks like, imagine men wrapping their feet in strips of cloth because boots have become memory. Imagine officers deciding whether to burn spare wagons to make momentary warmth that will save a few, while knowing that every wagon lost is one more nail hammered into the coffin of supply. Imagine surgeons cutting frostbitten flesh with hands so cold the knife feels like part of their own bones. The most dangerous element was not temperature. It was confidence made blind by years of success. One plan had worked so often that it became a belief. Defeating armies had always forced negotiations. Here they did not. Space crushed supply. Faith in decisive battle met a foe willing to bleed without breaking. Leadership is a strange mirror. It shows you the face you think you have until a fog rolls in, and you cannot tell whether the image is yours or the sum of your mistakes. In that fog, men at every level made choices. Marshals argued about routes. Quartermasters begged for time that did not exist. Officers told men to hold ranks while everything around them dissolved. The emperor read reports that softened realities and wrote directives that hardened expectations. Was there a moment, sitting in a room inside the Kremlin, when he understood that the city was a trap, disguised as a jewel? Was there a moment when the certainty that had carried him through 100 decisions melted like ice over a candle? The consequences did not end at a river. Allies watched numbers and changed sides. The coalition broadened. A Prussian general who had marched under orders now listened to the sound of a nation's heart beating faster and chose to move in a different direction. An Austrian diplomat calculated odds in rooms where maps were spread large enough to cover tables and mines at the same time. Another great battle swallowed more men and broke the scaffolding that held satellite states together. The field at Leipzig became a vast stage where the drama of reversal filled the horizon. Within months, fighting reached gates no enemy had touched for decades. Villages in France heard the sound of foreign drums, and mothers told children to stay away from windows. An emperor signed away a crown not because of a single day in Belgium, but because the empire died on winter roads in Russia, and everything after was inevitable. Waterloo reads well in stories because one day is easier to hold than a season, yet the hinge had already turned. The lesson is not that frost defeats generals, it is that means must match ends, that logistics outvote glory, that knowing when to stop can be the difference between retreat and ruin. In the ash of Moscow, in the ice of the Berezina, in the quiet at the Niemen, the warning speaks clearly. The question is whether leaders hear it before they learn it the hard way. There is a temptation to look for monsters that fit easily into sentences. Winter is such a monster. It arrives on time in places that have their own calendar of pain. Yet winter is not a scheme, it is a condition. The scheme was belief, that old and simple belief that power can always buy solutions, that speed can always outrun doubt, that courage can always fill the gap between what is needed and what is possible. Courage did its noble work. Men stood and fell, and their names echo in regimental lists and in letters that reached homes long after the men did not. One letter from a captain to his wife speaks of cold, in terms usually reserved for grief. "I cannot feel my hands," he wrote, "and I cannot feel the world." Such language tells you that this is not only about temperature, it is about the distance between plan and ground. What would it have meant to stop earlier? To recognize that a city burnt to its bones is no throne for diplomacy. To admit that space is as much an enemy as an opposing general. Telling men to turn around is hard when every day has taught you that one more push will bring a door down. Yet the strongest leaders keep a ledger inside their own heads, and they know when the numbers cannot add up, no matter how fiercely you write them. Every decision carries shadows. The shadow of pride is stubbornness. The shadow of ambition is blindness. The shadow of success is the belief that it will continue because it has continued. History has a table where all these sit and argue, and history allows you to listen if you are quiet enough. Listen to small sounds. The clink of a pot in a camp that is running out of things to put in pots. The cough of a soldier who has continued on. The cough that sounds like a tolling bell when dozens join it. The river, always the river, speaking the language of boundaries and crossings. That frozen river in Poland did not just divide land, it divided time, before and after, certainty and doubt, march and memory. A general counted survivors. Numbers mattered because numbers are the bones of armies, but something else was counted that day, something not written in any official report. You can call it cost if you like. You can call it lesson. You can call it warning. Consider what would have changed if Moscow had not burned. Would envoys have arrived with paper and seals? Would the emperor have sat at a table and watched signatures spread ink like balm over wounds? Or would the city have offered only the same emptiness, a different shape but the same result? Fire is dramatic. Ash is eloquent. Yet the slow grinding of logistics over distance would have pushed its truth forward, whether or not flames wrote headlines. Many of the men who died did so in ditches that existed because wagons could not reach them. A story can turn winter into a villain and then close the book. Or it can leave pages open and let you see that decisions are the drifts that bury armies. The image of a soldier cutting strips from a dead horse to eat is visceral and cruel, but it contains more policy than you might think. Horses die when too many miles and too little food meet. The army loses not only speed, but the power to carry food for men who still walk on feet that blister and bleed. A general is a manager of hunger and distance. A mistake with either is a wound that does not close. In the end, what remains? A field covered with snow and with the shape of footsteps in it. Footsteps that do not make it to a village. A city rebuilt over years. Every new beam laid like an answer to a question someone asked before they died. A map altered not by ink, but by the decisions of kings and ministers who learned that an empire's reach has bones that can break. A leader who sits in exile and looks at the sea, and perhaps hears the river in Poland whispering in the sound of waves, reminding him that water remembers crossings and failures in the same voice. The warning speaks clearly. It speaks in the brittle crack of ice under a boot. It speaks in the rustle of pages in a ledger when a quartermaster tries to find calories that are not there. It speaks in the silence after cannon, the silence that is louder than drums. The question is whether leaders hear it before they learn it the hard way. What breaks a giant faster, a storm of winter, or the moment an empire refuses to admit how far it has outpaced reality? The honest answer does not favor one alone. It tells you that giants fall when weather meets will, in a place where means and ends have walked away from each other. The world is full of such places. The names change, the conditions change. The warning did not melt with that river. It remains, and it waits for ears. If you walk today where those soldiers walked, you can still find the curve of a road that holds a memory like a hand holds a coin. The sky is the same type of wide. The wind has not forgotten how to turn a cheek into a blade. You may see a small monument, a stone set by descendants who understood that the past is not over. It is present, carried forward by stories that refuse to sit quietly. There are names carved there. There are dates. There is the knowledge that the gap between ambition and capacity is where tragedy grows. Leaders who stand on that stone and listen might hear boots scraping ice and breath rasping. And then they might ask the only question that matters when maps tempt and armies gather. Is what we want possible with what we have? History does not answer for you. It offers the river as a mirror. Look, then decide.